Mark and Eva Beeson began collecting in the 1950s, and they made a decision to collect the artists of their time. They collected several artists in depth, such as John Brack, John Olsen, Geoffrey Smart, William Delafield Cook, and in that way the collection is very much an idiosyncratic personal collection of Australian painting, where they befriended many of these artists and continued to support them throughout their career. Edmund came to the museum and spent many hours looking through our storage and made this selection, keeping in mind that he wanted to both represent Mark and Eva Beeson's vision as well as the story of Australian art. And so he's chosen to represent several artists in depth, and he hasn't displayed the work chronologically, but rather looked at the many different themes that have been woven through modernism in Australia.
I tried to do two things with the show, I think. One was obviously to explore the collections of TarraWarra, Beeson, etc. And then secondly, to give it a theme of some kind. Curators love themes. We can't just put things out and enjoy them. We've got to sort of link it all up and give it a narrative of some kind. When you looked at the collection here, you could see this wonderful panorama of the modern art of Australia. This still has the hallmark of the personality, the eyes of Mark and Eva Beeson. It has that wonderful sense of personality to it.
Edmund has brought his characteristic flair to this exhibition by calling it the triumph of modernism. Many might argue that modernism is no longer relevant, but what Edmund's eyes and vision has done is shown us how important and significant modernism has been for Australian artists in the post-Second World War period.
Modernism really begins in the early 20th century with all the artists not just trying to seek representation, but to interpret representation. Not to depict what you saw, but to interpret the experience of that subject.
This exhibition shows us the many ways in which Australian artists took on a modernist point of view, whether it was through their interpretation of the landscape, the increase of industrialisation, the representation of human expression and passion, a notion that the Australian landscape has a very individual look or feel, or indeed contemporary artists still working with many of these same themes. One thing that I think this exhibition demonstrates is the unique ways in which Australian artists dealt with the concept of modernism, because they were at a remove from the heart of modernism, which at that time, post-World War II, was in Europe.
Artists started to make work, in a sense, art for art's sake and not as commission. So giving it the intellectual and emotional experience as opposed to just the visual experience. So that to me is what modernism is about. But what we have here is that second flourish after World War II. It wasn't so much just the Australian landscape. It was the Australian experience that they explored. And you've only got to look around here and look at Arthur's Bride series or Sid Kelly series or whatever. And for them, the Australian landscape, which had been the dominant theme, and the thing which had actually identified Australian art, was but a theatre. It was a stage for the human drama, the human experience. And I think that was the huge and the great and the liberating contribution that these artists made. Even Drysdale as well. I mean, he's much more, perhaps less about the sort of psychological experience, which I think both Arthur Boyd and Sid Nolan achieved. And then I was looking some years ago at a particular Central Australian picture like the one in there. I was looking at that. There's not a figure to be seen. You know the story that Sid went off in a plane and with looked over the landscape and came up with these images. And I said, there's not a figure to be seen, but the human experience is still there. This is not an empty landscape. That's a landscape with a human soul in it. I think this is the great thing that, above all, both Arthur Boyd and Sid Nolan achieved. Drysdale, too, is in the same vein. I think there's a big difference. The Drysdale pictures are very specific, and somehow the figures there are almost totems in the landscape. They become part of it. What Boyd and Nolan did was put the drama of the human experience, the drama of the human tragedy or the human passion into their pictures and into the Australian landscape. And Fred Williams, again, drawing on that landscape tradition, was somebody who found an extraordinary, completely individual language. That's a vocabulary that he uses. But what I also liked was the idea that modernism doesn't die, it's still continuing. Then there was the parallel journey, the urban journey. You remember that in the 50s, obviously, there was greater urbanisation of Australia, and you've got the parallel journey with Brack and Blackman and artists like that. Few paintings have that kind of absolutely spontaneous joie de vivre that Olsen's have. Out in the end room there, with the Howard Arcleys and Imants, and it's Joanna Lamb, the Flatlands. And Brett Whiteley, he was, I think, one of the most energetic and amazing artists and amazing people that I met in Australia. I don't know whether you've been to the Whiteley studio, but it's like this place, the aura, the spirit, the atmosphere, the climate.
When people come to the museum, they absolutely love it. And it's not just the collection, it's the whole atmosphere of the location. I think Edmund Capon has fallen in love with the museum.
It's the perfect fit into the landscape. It has the most wonderful atmosphere. And above all, somehow with the works of art, and particularly with a show like this, the spirit, the soul of the people who made it possible, I think breathes through this building. And that's something that we can all feel. This must be one of the most sublime art museums in the world. No doubt about it.